eyes and working conditions of creative and cultural workforce in the EU before, during, and after the COVID-19. In today's webinar, we will explore more about new business and revenue models in the creative economies and policies for managing cultural ecology. But first of all, before we start, some technicalities. If you have problems hearing us, please refresh your browser, and if this does not work, go to a different browser. We would like to make this session interactive, so you will see a chat box in which you can write whenever you want. And you can also, you're very welcome to ask questions, because we will have Q&As. In 5 minutes, we will activate the question mode, and you can send your questions to all of us. After each presentation is done, we will share the presentations with you already during the webinar. The session will be recorded, and please ask your questions to the presenters and researchers at any time in the chat box. After each presentation, we will have a Q&A with questions from our audience. The webinar today is divided into 3 blocks. First, after me, Tere Badia will give you more news on economic issues related to our sector. Then Jarna Heinonen will introduce DISCE project. We will then have a little survey for you, and we would like to hear more about our audience today. This will all be followed by a second block with a presentation and discussion by Ulla Hütti from Turku University. She will talk about new business and revenue models. This is followed by a Q&A led by Sandy Fitzgerald. Then we will move to a second presentation by Nick Wilson and by Jonathan Gross, both of King's College London, on managing creative economies as cultural ecosystems. The Q&A will be led by Robert Manchin, President of Culture Action Europe. But first, I would like to give the floor to Tere Badia, Secretary General of Culture Action Europe.
Yeah, hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mika. And thank you to all the members of the DISCE project for having, again, Culture Action Europe in this webinars. As you know, COVID-19 has hit the arts and the cultural sectors very severely. So we were talking about this last webinar, and diverse research projects like DISCE, multiple surveys, statements coming from diverse cultural stakeholders have been very explicit about the huge impact of this crisis among cultural operators at all levels and its diversity. So, but beyond a sectoral approach that could be like regarding at the organization, institutions, cultural producers, and so on, and how this situation is affecting them. Beyond the sectoral approach, culture and cultural practices includes much more. It has effects in societal challenges through crossovers with other areas of action, like, for example, individual and collective well-being, cohesion, environment, education, research, and innovation, among others. Therefore, its inclusion in any mid- and long-term recovery plan is not an option, but a fundamental need. Taking the world in consideration, we have been in the last weeks advocating for this fundamental role of culture in rebuilding a sustainable post-pandemic Europe. And one of the most powerful instruments for the recovery is, of course, the European budget. Last week, the Commission proposed the member states revised multi-annual financial frameworks, the name of for the next 7 years. It is the budget. And despite the effort to put together the biggest EU budget of all the times, the proposal has been presented is unambitious for culture. On one side, there's a new instrument. It's called Next Generation Europe. It's focused on the future we want to build after the COVID situation, the COVID crisis. Despite the name, Next Generation does not channel any additional money specifically to Creative Europe, and disregards in this way the contribution of culture in building this sustainable and inclusive and fairer societies. And these are the core objective of these new recovery packages. So now it's on the member states to make sure that the additional cohesion funds coming from this Next Generation EU program initiative reach the cultural actors. On the other side, the figure of the education, culture, and youth programs are not in line with a statement by the President von der Leyen on the importance of future generations, along with education and culture. We note that the new budget reduces funding for Creative Europe, which is the only European program dedicated to culture. Doubling Creative Europe budget, as we have been asking for years together with the European Parliament, is more urgent than ever. However, the Commission has made some steps backwards by decreasing the overall figure of Creative Europe that now represents only a 0.08% of the whole package. That ignores the catastrophic impact that the pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns have had on cultural and creative sectors. That's why we need to call also the member states to double the budget for Creative Europe, as this is the core and unique program for reinforcing European cohesion and cooperation through culture. So at this point, nothing else. The floor is yours, Mike.
Thank you, Tere. Thank you for this beautiful introduction. And now I would like to introduce to you Jarna Heinonen. She is the principal investigator of the DISCE consortium, and she is connected to the University of Turku in Finland. And she will give an introduction on the DISCE project.
Thank you, Mika and Tere, for your introductions to the webinar. It is really great to be here discussing about our research project, DISCE. DISCE stands for Developing Inclusive and Sustainable Creative Economies, and it raises up a question. What are inclusive and sustainable creative economies? And more importantly, how can they be developed? It sounds so simple, but in order to tackle the question, we have joined our forces. DISCE is a partnership of 4 European research institutes. In addition to University of Turku, Finland, we have researchers from the Gran Sasso Science Institute from Italy, King's College London from the UK, and Stockholm School of Economics Riga from Latvia. DISCE has also 2 experienced stakeholder partners, namely Comedier from Brussels and the European Network Trans-Europe House from Lund. We are most grateful for them organizing this webinar series, which actually demonstrate our DISCE approach. To find out what are inclusive and sustainable economies, we actively co-create and interact with stakeholders to validate the relevance of our findings. This webinar is one way to communicate with our stakeholders, and we hope that there will be more and different types of events for us to continue two-way conversations with you. DISCE approach is not only about co-creation, it is also about conducting research with multiple methods. Through robust statistical analysis, we create new and more sensitive indicators to portray creative economies in Europe. We also wish to develop rich understanding of the creative economies through regional case studies, which focus on different types of creative ecologies found around 10 middle-sized European towns. Last fall, we started our regional case studies with a pilot in Enschede, the Netherlands. And we have just started other regional case studies in Pori, Finland, in Liepaja, Latvia, in L'Aquila, Italy, and in Dundee, the UK. We will continue with the other 5 case studies after this summer. Given the restrictions related to the COVID-19, you may imagine that we needed to change our plans with empirical fieldwork. We have quickly turned to online mode with our interviews, surveys, and consultations. Nevertheless, we expect our fieldwork to be finalized by the end of this year. DISCE approaches the inclusive and sustainable creative economies from different angles. Through improved indicators at national and EU level, we will develop a comprehensive understanding of creative economies and their performance. We also explore creative and cultural workforce, skills development, and the creative higher education provision across Europe to consider how training and skills can address the future challenges. Furthermore, DISCE investigates new forms of activity and related value creation models, be it in work, unpaid work, self-employment, or in companies. Soon my colleagues from the University of Turku will tell you how we approach innovative ways for inclusive and sustainable value creation in creative economies. Finally, DISCE rethinks inclusive and sustainable growth by considering growth not only as GDP, but also as cultural development. You will also hear about this today from my colleagues from the King's College. To summarize, DISCE will indeed challenge the existing understanding of the nature and role of creative economies in the society. This will be done by answering the research questions. So please stay tuned and follow our research. While I now turn this back to Mike, I encourage you all to engage with DISCE today and also in the future.
Thank you so much, Jarna. So before I introduce the next speaker, we would like to know who you are, who is our audience today. And therefore we send a small survey in the webinar window. It would be great if you can click on your profession. And while you're doing this, I would like to use the time to introduce the second block of this webinar with Ulla Hytti, professor of the University of Turku, on new business and revenue models. Within the context of DISCE project, they are looking into individual, organizational, network, and policy-making levels for business models, earning logics, and value creation within the context of creative economies, and how all of this works. Recently, all of our cultural activities have moved online instead of live performing in theaters, operas, music, etc. So the topic is more urgent than ever, as it directly affects how artists work, how cultural managers, producers, technicians, etc. are affected by this COVID situation. Sandy Fitzgerald from Olive Cultural Agency will lead you through the Q&A together with Pekka Stenholm, Senior Researcher Fellow, University of Turku. And a reminder, please send your questions to the presenters in the chat box. Pekka and Sandy and Ulla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning from me this morning, and I will be sharing a few ideas on the value creation in the creative economy. We have all become acutely aware that COVID-19 has had a drastic impact on the creative economies. And as already mentioned, we have seen some innovative solutions come out recently, at least as a sort of emergency solutions to overcome this period. So we've seen live streaming of different sorts, of smaller scale, larger scale, but also return to the roots, kind of very small scale performances, theater performances, for example, through the windows for the patients in elderly care, for example, or residents in elderly care. A local exhibition center that also lost all of its business has started cooperating with the creative organizations in order to launch a series of drive-in performances. But what about when going to the future? Will the live streaming options be available mainly to the large and established organizations, or and sort of crowd out smaller scale grassroots activity? Will these new solutions only be demonstrations of resilience of the creative sector as sort of emergency solutions, or is there a way out for them to become models of the future that are sustainable, making a decent living for all those concerned? We are discussing the COVID-19 impact on creative economy, but I would like to raise up another level of the impact on our whole society and on our social lives in general. At least in Finland, we keep hearing about the new normal. So when we are coming out from this, we are not expecting to return to the life as we knew it, or to the to the past, but to something new. To me, this implies that we are expecting important changes in society and in our values. If there are changes in what the societies and we as citizens and individuals value, then there should be ample opportunity potential for new value creation models. So the question of value seems to be at the core of things. But actually, what is value is a very complex issue. Here's a take from a Swedish researcher, Martin Lakeus, in the context of entrepreneurship education. But I think we can apply to the creative economy as well. What Martin suggests and actually recommends is to move away from the dichotomous value view of value between social value or economic value, and actually suggest an array of different values. So why is it that I'm doing what I'm doing? Is it for the pure joy of it, fun of it? Is it to become famous and the most influential person in my field? Is it to create economic value for my partners or relieve suffering of others? Besides our values, there is also a note from Grönroos and Voima on the need to understand our customers, users, and participants' values. It sounds simple enough, but in reality, it's very challenging because people generally find it difficult to explain it themselves. Let me take a very simple example. Why would somebody pay hundreds of thousands of euros for a car, while another one is satisfied with the one of 100 euros, if in principle both cars take you from place A to place B? Or to make it more complicated, let's move to the intangible world. What is the value for me to going to a live performance, watching a film or a series on Netflix, or simply laying on my back on my couch and channel surfing? What is the value of these different things and how they are different or similar to one another? But now, when I started with the COVID-19 impact on the values. So, how are these values now changing, and how do we keep track on the changing values, and how we might use that in our sort of understanding of what we are doing? So it's not only about our values, it's our partners, cooperation partners' values, and the end users' values. But these values, together with our resources, form the basis where we can sort of start imagining and start processes that might lead to something new, that tap onto these new values and create hopefully more inclusive and more sustainable services and content for ourselves at the same time. So let me summarize with a sort of a golden circle. Start with why from Simon Sinek. This is a TEDx talk and also a book nowadays. What he says and suggests that most organizations start, and most people start with what they do. And everybody can say what they do. Some people and some organizations can explain how they do it, but a very few organizations, very few people can explain why they do it. And in Sinek's words, this is the the sign of the successful ones, that we start with the why, we start with the values. Why is it that we are doing what we are doing? And this will help us to in our value creation. So thank you for this, and now it's over to Sandy.
Thank you very much, Ulla. That's very interesting, particularly your last slide. I'd like to bring Pekka in, maybe, Pekka, because you're heavily involved in this as well. Do you have any comments or additions to make to what Ulla said?
Well, I agree with what Ulla said, and basically want to highlight the importance of, in addition to basically thinking about only the business models, how do they transform now? Is it as important or even more important to make sense that why and how the organizations exist? And that would be solving also that what value they are creating. And that leads to a new, maybe updated understanding of how that value creation will be done when it comes to a business model.
And as you've gone through this process, obviously you started out before COVID hit, and now this new reality has arrived. Have your views changed or your processes changed because of that, where you were hit by this in the middle of your research?
With regards to what Jarno already mentioned, that the data collection procedures had to be changed because we had planned the workshops, which are not an option now, and they have been moved on online versions. But other than that, we have slightly also transferred and included some of the discussions that take place with the recipients and the respondents and those who are invited to the interviews, that we also address slightly the current situation, in addition to the main topics that we have for the project.
Well, maybe, sorry, go ahead, Ulla.
Yeah, I mean, but also in the content-wise, that of course, as we have heard, this represents a crisis, and in this sense, but also when things are moving, it's also easier to do change and to move towards a direction that we are hoping for. So in that sense, I think this is a very crucial message to all of us concerned.
Right. Maybe we could move on, because we don't have much time, onto some questions that are coming in. Yeah. So there's one here, which I'll just publish for you. Can you see that question? So how will you contribute to the current situation in your research?
Well, hopefully we are doing research, and hopefully there will be research outputs from the project. But we are hoping also to be clever with designing tools, or sort of these kind of canvases are now very used in, for example, in entrepreneurship education. But they may not be applicable in themselves to the creative economy. So we hopefully, through the research and through our work with our colleagues, we can develop easy canvases that could be used by the creative organizations to tap onto these different values and understanding them, and then turning them into value creation models and modeling practices.
Right. And because we don't have much time, I mean, following on from that, any insights at this point into the future based on what you have learned so far? Can you actually share anything with everybody about possible solutions or possible directions that people might take?
No, this is a situation what Saraswati might describe as a situation of true uncertainty. Nobody knows, and hence it's not possible for anybody to predict and try to go towards the right solution. This is the time to create the future, to take action, to start the balls rolling, to try to move into the direction that one wants together with others. So of course, this is not the a work of a lonely rider, but this is a joint force, and hence I'm very happy to see so many of you here and joining this movement. I think is important now.
Okay, and another comment, maybe, and question about this idea of the new normal, right? Which I will publish here, hopefully. Which is, we should be very careful, right, around the term. There's the question there.
Yeah, that was something that Ulla reflected, that it's sort of the general discussion is reflecting the new normal, which is easy to put on the news and the letters, but it's really difficult to digest what actually does it mean and what does it require. And I don't yet see that what is normal in the current situation, in the sense that can we call it the new normal. But I would reflect also what Ulla already mentioned, that this is an opportunity for create a future that sort of survives over this current situation. And let's not decide what it's called yet, but it might be something else, and hopefully the new normal, new better or something like that.
Right. And Mika actually has a question, which is, we know from other sectors and other sectors could maximize the impacts of cultural and creative industries in our societies. How can research transition to implementation through other sectors, such as tourism, for instance, which has its own problems at the moment?
Well, partly facing uncertainty is key determinant to us, our point of view here, and how to survive it is dependent, of course, of the context. But the ways of acting on the uncertainty are related to it's not all about experimentation, but not to get stuck where we are now, but in order to find a new way is to sort of try out new things, even though it's resourceful and so on. But transferring what we come out and understand is transferable to other contexts as well, but not directly. You have to digest it a little bit in order to make it happen. But sort of, we have general terms, what I was trying to reflect by the uncertainty concept, that is similar in other contexts as well. So there might be the tools are then applicable in other contexts as well.
I just related to that. I mean, with the wider world, right, and the general picture, proposals like one that came from Spain today, I think, about this idea again of a universal income, for instance, which seems like something that could be very beneficial to the cultural sector, particularly the freelancers and all of that. Are you looking at the general picture as well, and how people might actually benefit from general policies like that?
Well, that would be because as you probably most of you know, that Finland was having an experiment with the income project that lasted for 2 years, and unfortunately the outcomes are still sort of, we know some of the outcomes from the first year, and then only the discussions related to the unemployment, which is okay, but then the context related to our discussion today is yet unknown. So in sense of how does that might influence the ways of people participating in creating new value and creating culture, and so that remains to be seen. But that might be one of the key things that later could be also tested out, but it's not an easy task to test at the society level to make that kind of a movement to happen.
No, but as you say, interestingly, Finland has already carried out the experiment, so you're kind of in a good position there to give some insights because you're connected, I guess. Yeah,
the slightly in the field, for example, in testing out their entrepreneurship behaviors, because usually the general discussion revolves around the risk taking and that kind of thing, and that economic risk was now taken away. So the initial results show that people were more eager to try out their own sort of initiations to test their wings as an entrepreneur. And unfortunately, they didn't stay so long. But these are not like the I don't know how scientifically proven results they are yet. But there were signs that people might be more eager to go to the direction than their own sort of what value they want to bring to the society might lead us to the steps that they want to take. So that might be a chance that this kind of income solution might be solvable, providing that kind of solution. But I wouldn't say that that's the most likely outcome in the current situations.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that with your research and what you're doing, do you think it's possible to counteract, say, funding cuts with impact evidence, with what you're involved in? Do you think that has a possibility?
Well, maybe as a DISCE project as a whole, together with our partners, with everybody concerned, maybe, but I mean, sometimes it seems that the policymakers are quite immune to research results unless it confirms what they already know or think. So this is a challenging task, and that's why I think there needs to be this kind of movement into some direction, and that should be rallied between the researchers and all the stakeholders.
Okay, unfortunately we have to wrap up there. Our time is very limited, but thank you very much, Ulla. Thank you, Pekka. And I'm going to hand you back now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulla, Pekka, and Sandy. And now I would like to announce our next session. And the third block is about managing creative economies as cultural ecosystems. How do we define the cultural sector? Should we change the definition? What does it mean to manage the cultural ecology, and who does it? What does it involve, and what are or should be the priorities? And what are the policy challenges and problems, particularly in the light of COVID-19? This session will be presented by Nick Wilson, Professor of Culture, Creativity, and Jonathan Gross, Teaching Fellow and Research Fellow. Both Nick and Jonathan work at King's College London, and the Q&A session will be led by Robert Manchin, President of Culture Action Europe. Please again, send all your questions to the presenters in the chat box. And gentlemen, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Hello. It's really lovely to be here with you today. So my name is Nick Wilson, and I'll be joined, as Mika says, by my colleague Jonathan Gross for this short presentation from the DISCE project titled Managing Creative Economies as Cultural Ecosystems. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we've all heard, has brought many things sharply into focus. Some things that were never thought likely have transpired, and other things that were never thought possible have been made possible. So in being required to become accustomed to, or at least familiar with, a life in which social distancing, social isolation, and lockdown are daily realities, the value of many of the interconnections and the interdependencies that just a few months ago we took for granted are now being highlighted by their very absence. Nowhere is this more true, perhaps, than in the context of culture. And it's against this backdrop that DISCE is focusing on developing inclusive and sustainable creative economies across Europe, and taking on a new and vital significance in that respect. So over the last 5 years or so, Jonathan and I have been working on a number of research projects that have in their different ways been exploring these interconnections and interdependencies and how they elaborate across culture. As an overarching narrative, if you like, we have been developing an account of creative and cultural practices, of the arts, of the cultural sector, that expands who and what is included and how they depend upon each other. In our research, first of all, for the Get Creative initiative commissioned by the BBC and others, we introduced the notion of everyday creativity, activities that happen beyond subsidized culture and commercial creative industries, but crucially, which are deeply connected with them. We took an explicitly ecological focus to our work then with a new direction on caring for cultural freedom. And this was a study focused on supporting young people's cultural learning. And then we asked the question, what makes a flourishing cultural ecosystem, in research commissioned by the Creative People and Places Network in the UK. Most recently, we've brought this way of thinking about the wider cultural ecology to DISCE's focus on creative economies. And Jonathan will elaborate further on this now.
So I'm going to speak briefly about our research with Creative People and Places, and then explain how we're feeding that into our work on DISCE in the overall approach to DISCE. So Creative People and Places is an initiative of Arts Council England that's been going on for about 5 years. And it's in effect an experiment in devolved arts investment. So rather than Arts Council deciding what cultural activity gets funded, they gave £37 million to 21 locations, and those 21 locations through different processes decided how the money would be spent. And Creative People and Places were interested in a piece of research to understand the cultural ecosystems within those 21 locations, and Nick and I were commissioned to undertake that research. But as Eleonora Belfiore rightly said this morning, there's been an upsurge of use of the language of cultural ecology. And within that kind of flurry of different usages, Nick and I felt it was really important to distinguish between 3 different uses of the term cultural ecology. So in the CPP report, we distinguish between cultural ecology as a condition of the world. In other words, this is how culture happens, through interconnections, interdependencies between cultural resources of different kinds. And I'll come back to the notion of cultural resources in a moment. But secondly, cultural ecology is a descriptive or analytical perspective. In other words, it's a way that we can do research. It's a way that we can understand how culture is happening. Thirdly and finally, and perhaps least developed, is cultural ecology as an approach to cultural policy, programming and practice. In other words, deliberately seeking to care for, to manage the interconnections and interdependencies between different kinds of cultural resources. And it's really important to emphasize there are many different ways in which that could happen, with many different kinds of political commitments, from human rights to cultural democracy to an ethics of care, that could be embedded within many different approaches to that third notion of cultural ecology. So just to distinguish between 2 terms, which again, Nick and I think are helpful, we use cultural ecology to refer to the overall condition of interconnectivity between cultural resources, interdependence between cultural resources, through which culture happens. But within the overall cultural ecology, there are many different ecosystems. And within the CPP report, on the basis of our interviews, our focus groups, our surveys across the CPP locations, we document 54 examples of different cultural resources within those ecosystems. And those resources can be tangible or intangible. So just to give you a few of those 54 examples, tangible resources include everything from cultural organizations to businesses of many kinds, to sports clubs, to libraries, to car parks, to the public transport systems, all of those, but also intangible resources like relationships, skills, memories, and histories within the ecosystem. So those are all cultural resources, but of course, they don't exist in isolation. They exist through systemic conditions that link them, that enable them, constrain them in different ways. And we identify 9 examples of these, and I'll just give you a few from that CPP research. Public services and cuts to public services, how do they condition these relationships? What's the role of the local authority, the role of universities in connecting up resources? What about digital platforms? How do they condition these relationships? Something we call geographies of belonging. In other words, people don't necessarily identify with the boundaries of a local authority. They have particular geographies to which they feel they belong. And finally, self-recognition. In other words, does this ecosystem have ways of recognizing itself as such? Do people feel that they're part of an ecosystem or not? So within that research, we developed 14 considerations for the development of a flourishing cultural ecosystem. So these are considerations for different kinds of scale of practice, from particular groups, particular organizations, to a local authority, to a national level government, across different scales. I've just put 7 up on the screen for illustrative purposes. You can read them in more detail in the report, along with the other 7, all 14 of them. But for now, I just want to draw out 2 of them in particular. So we stress the possibility of new kinds of leadership, ecological leadership. In other words, leadership of ecosystems being a commitment to the overall connectivity, the overall flourishing of that system, rather than specific organizations or particular practices within it. And alongside that, new forms of governance. So here the question of inclusivity is key. How do you keep open who's in the room of decision making? What would a form of ecological governance look like? And these are questions that we're keen to explore much further within our 10 regional case studies within DISCE. So far, we've only done our first case study in Enschede in the east of the Netherlands. And I'm just going to draw out 3 very provisional findings from that initial fieldwork, which speaks to these ideas. The first is that we're hearing from our research participants the sense that there are multiple systems within the ecosystem. So, for example, some participants very strongly identify with the art scene. They say, I'm in the art scene. Others are in the theatre scene. And we're hearing that these scenes don't necessarily speak to each other. We're hearing conflicted or conflicting accounts of how well connected the city is. So some people will say, Enschede is a small city. It's very easy to know everything that's going on. Or Enschede has clear governance arrangements with bodies who have an overview of the city. And then other interviewees have said, the city is so poorly connected that I wouldn't say we have a creative economy at all. That's what one interviewee said. But the third and final finding that I want to draw out is the way in which our participants are talking about how poorly Enschede tells its story. And questions of the storytelling of the city, we're suggesting, are really closely connected to notions of ecological leadership and governance in the sense of who tells this story of what the city is. And we're interested in exploring notions of self-narration of the ecosystem, which are far beyond city branding, but are in a sense parts of the democratic process of ecological governance.
So in terms of our own story, the story we've unfolded in this short presentation, I hope you've been persuaded of the significance of thinking first in terms of the cultural ecology across these 3 ways of theorizing it. First, as a condition of the way the world is. Second, as a way of thinking about, exploring, analyzing, talking about the interconnections and interdependencies of this reality. But thirdly, as a strategic approach to doing cultural policy in an inclusive and sustainable way. And in respect to this latter view, we'd like to leave you with 2 concluding observations. So first, what is being argued for here involves holding open the space for determining who is involved, how they are involved, and to the extent to which they take part in the decision making, and that must be undertaken in an open and unparticipative way. This must be understood against a backdrop, of course, of what many in an ecological context are referring to as the need for radical system change. Our much needed response to climate change and threats to biodiversity. And in this sense, public reason about culture cannot be narrowly focused on only arts and cultural organizations, and indeed some sense of controlling their environment, but must find new ways of being both inclusive and sustainable. Second, we need new ways of communicating the value of culture, the value of cultural ecosystems. We need new stories, as Jonathan says, new accounts, narratives, and so on. And here the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that new stories that make us think differently about value are indeed possible. Just think, for example, about the repositioning of the sometimes undervalued work of doctors, nurses, and those in the social care sector over these last 10 weeks or so as essential care work. Is it not also the case that creative and cultural work constitutes essential care work, albeit of a different kind? So finally, in asking you to reflect on managing creative economies as cultural ecosystems, we have been, in effect, offering another new narrative, a story of developing inclusive and sustainable creative economies in terms of caring for cultural ecosystems. In effect, caring for cultural ecosystems becomes what cultural policy is, a process of attentive, responsive, skilled, open, co-produced decision-making and practice. Just how this caring process can be and should be taken forward is the subject of our continuing work in DISCE, of course, not least as we develop our policy fora in the months ahead. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick and Jonathan. It was really refreshing to hear a language talking about some of these issues, which is trying to reshape the discussions as well. As you, Nick, just mentioned, to control the policy discussions also means to control a language on which we can discuss about these issues. And this is really very interesting in terms of framing the policy debates. If I didn't hear for a moment the term cultural sector from any of you. I am coming from an organization which defines itself as doing advocacy work for the whole cultural sector in Europe. Is there a cultural ecosystem of Europe as well? Maybe. Can the concepts, what you were describing, go from a local to something which is a semi-existing system, which is European cultural ecosystem? And this is really partly a question, partly just reflections, which I really enjoyed listening to something which is not repeating the same old cliches, but try to introduce terms which can be used in actual things. Ecology and cultural ecology probably has its roots in anthropology. And the anthropologists have been using it quite frequently. I'm old enough to remember in the 1960s, 70s, which were more or less the interaction between nature, natural environment, and how human societies can adapt. Now, this is really, again, something which might be used your framework. Can culture help to adapt to something where we are? Is it really the function or the goal of culture, in this sense of cultural ecology, to do that? You repeated at the end, Nick, the very layered approach, going from understanding the ontological reality, as you call it, basically the condition of the word. And only after that comes the more how we know about this, about the techniques of describing or analyzing of the cultural scene, which you call the epistemological approach. And then from there follows the organization or the cultural policy per se. The question is it really a natural, is it really a sequence? Is it a hubris to start analyzing without answering the basic questions of what kind of world are we living in? Can we really frame our research without grasping a shared understanding? Because I think culture also is not an individual concept, right? So you need to have a shared understanding of what kind of world we are living here. We just heard before that nobody knows what kind of world we are living in, not even where we are truly in a fluid, Bauman used to talk about fluid modernity. Now we are really in the middle of complete insecure situation. That also means that it's very hard to deduce from an ontological view all the way down to a policy, organizational, managerial approach through the process. But I mean, it was really helping me as well. Again, as I am a practitioner, if you like, in a board with discussing my board colleagues and the team of how can we approach this basic dilemma, where on the one hand we are saying no, we are not a sectoral representation. We are trying to put culture in the core of what policy is, but at the same time, I have to confess, I have sometimes a little self-doubt. Am I a little imperialist here to taking over all policy fields under the umbrella of cultural and cultural policy? But your term is really more an umbrella term, the cultural ecology, as far as I can see. It's really a societal approach where you are trying to put together, and this is really system thinking, when you are trying to say that this is really all kinds of dependencies from the tangible, intangible resources and the various interaction between those. So it's really you are trying to grasp the complexity of the system. And I really congratulate you to help us to think on that term, not to be a very simply to try to understand the drivers. But of course, when we are looking at the concrete things, like we are doing something which is called pilot cities, where we go in and try to help to figure out for local actors of what is the situation there in the field, in the given city, or like the European capitals of cultures. I see you are going to my country page, Hungary, within the project soon enough. You will see the complexities of trying to create a cultural ecosystem and all the involvement. But this is really, and this is my probably my final point is when you are going to the more practical side, if you allow me to say that, of developing and flourishing a cultural ecosystem. Here, I had the feeling that we have to really be very careful on defining who is the actor here. Who is the one who is taking time? Who is the person who is seeking out partnership? Who is the one who is deliberately building something? It's a little bit smacks to me a vision where somebody is going in like a cultural animator and try to intervene in a cultural system in order to manage into a desirable direction. whose interest to serve there in a complex situation. As soon as you go in, we are a parachuting actor, so, definitely from Brussels going into Timisoara, not really knowing the intricacies of the political system and so forth, spending a year just to know who is a little bit sombering experience, I would say.
Robert, could I respond very, very briefly, because I'm aware we're short of time. You make so many points, and there's much to say. What type of world do we live in, and the need for the practical focus? Titling this presentation in terms of managing creative economies, but also managing cultural ecosystems, is precisely to get at that tension between the sense in which, it's all very well to talk of a cultural ecology, but we do have a whole range of strategic interests in cultivating, tending, looking after, stewarding, managing, whatever verb we want to use, which are more or less sectorally focused, more or less focused on specific interests of systems, and as well as the kind of overall anthropological take of what a culture is. And so from that point of view, you're exactly right to focus on that tension of what that verb means to whom, and questions of power that Ellie, for example, picked up on this morning are absolutely central there. Jonathan, I know we're short of time, so I'll hand over to you.
I'll just pick up on 2 points connected to each other. Thanks, Robert. One was around scale and the question of scale at which this works. And the other is your question, how can culture help us to adapt? So as I indicated in the third usage of cultural ecology, thinking of it as an approach to policy, I said that it will always involve other normative commitments, other political commitments. So Nick and I are building on our work on cultural democracy. And for us, cultural democracy is a systemic condition. So we need to be thinking about how to realize it through cultural ecosystems. Now, I actually think the principle of subsidiarity that underpins the European project is an excellent one here, because in a sense, it's at the most local level that people know about their cultural resources and their relationships, and the kind of knowledge that needs to be produced on an ongoing basis needs to be local. But of course, we also know that these macro conditions have enormous consequences for the local. So that relationship of scale, I think, is a crucial one to think through, and how the principle of subsidiarity, taking decisions at the lowest possible level, the most local possible level, could be played out, I think is key here. And just very briefly, linking that to a piece that Nick and I are just about to publish on the Green New Deal and cultural policy. So very briefly, as you'll all be aware, the Green New Deal echoes the language of the New Deal of the 1930s, drawing attention to the possibility of large-scale government intervention in the economy. But writers on the Green New Deal very much stress that, unlike the 1930s, this needs to be a distributed approach, not top-down. And the piece that Nick and I have written is specifically about what is the role of culture within that. So the Green New Deal is a revolution in infrastructure, in our energy infrastructure, our transport infrastructure, but it also requires political mobilization. So there's the idea from Eric Klinenberg of social infrastructure, the organizations and places in which relationships are developed. Nick and I argue that cultural infrastructure is a subcategory of social infrastructure, those places where people tell stories and contest value. So in terms of how can culture help us to adapt, we're arguing it's absolutely central that these cultural infrastructures, these spaces of storytelling and value contestation must be part of any sort of macro transformation. This is, of course, at different scales.
Thank you, Jonathan. Just a very quickly question from the audience. From Ivo is saying, are the systematic conditions you identified are coming from a qualitative survey studies, or there is some quantitative analysis or experimental studies, or where it's coming from?
So the 9 systemic conditions that I ran through very quickly came out of a combination of interviews, focus groups, and surveys across the CPP network. We can't hear you, Robert.
Yeah, just a minute, because Tere, do you have any more questions? And before you wrap up?
No, I think, I have a lot of questions because it has been very, very interesting, and I can see as also a sort of the intentions of a systemic change, also in the approach how we as cultural sector work. There's a lot of concepts there, so growth or degrowth, sustainability, and its contradictions. Maybe sustainable development, it's also a contradiction in itself, and so on. So last week we were hearing about the need to create new indicators. I'm going to wrap up now about the whole session and the webinar. So we were thinking, we were hearing about the need to create new indicators. I think they are pretty much needed. So quantitative indicators helps, but they are not the only ones that should be on place. And mostly because it was proposed to use indicators based on inclusivity, sustainability, for complex sector, but it's not only a complex sector, it's also a complex reality that we have now. Today we have been talking a lot about the creation of value and about cultural ecology and the need to change this perspective when looking at it. And these contents, I think, they are more relevant than ever. So right now for me, and in the immediate future, this crisis is transforming the life of also for cultural institutions, but also the shape of cultural activities and projects, I think. And we must rethink everything, as maybe we are finally in a change, in a situation of changing the paradigm. So, and I think this webinar is really helping in proposing this challenging question. But for this, I think that it's really important to start an exercise, and this webinar is one of this, an exercise of critical reflection about our own way of functioning as cultural actors and operators, if necessary. On one hand, I think it's necessary to consider the relationship between the values frame on which we live and work and the ecosystem in which we find ourselves. On the other hand, I think there's a fundamental need to redefine the concept of development that goes beyond the perspective of a continued economic growth and takes into account the materiality and interdependence in the way in which life evolves also around us. In this sense, I think it's very interesting that the debates proposed by the project include somehow perspectives that I can identify that comes from a permaculture approach, that it's combining values, ecology, and sustainability, and makes visible how this interdependence works. And it approaches the development of the communities from principles such as the care of the context, the care of the people, and the fair share. And for me, this perspective of permaculture can help a lot in reflecting how sustainability in culture and cultural ecology approach. So this might look like, for example, transforming the cultural production models, analyzing tools, methodologies, technologies, infrastructure in which we live and upon where we act. All of them are affected by a system that reproduces extraction, exclusions, canons, hegemonies, and dominations, maybe. So we need to also take into account the feedback of the context to the models. And we have to consider also, when doing this exercise of radical imagination, that it's something that we're doing here, to propose transforming prototypes, so in the way we produce and we live. Yes, we have to be able to create the most with the least amount of damage. So we are talking about damages. So we're not really talking about damages, but maybe a good perspective could be also to create value from the side, from the point of view of the damage that whatever action or whatever project we do can cause or is caused. So this could be also a radical change of perspective, that respects both the contexts where we operate and the resources that we are using and all the people and living beings that are also involved in this. And of course includes a new approach of the concept of labor, minimum wage and UBI could be addressed here. I think the economic value, we have to also rethink the economic value as the overall regulator of culture. This is another topic that I think we have to reconsider. And finally, the consideration of reducing the vulnerability of the cultural ecosystem by also ensuring a diversity, the presence of diversity. So I think diversity, ecology, ecosystem, and vulnerability goes pretty much together in the hand. So, and that's it from me. So I think, thank you very much. So I've heard wonderful concepts, and I think I share most of these approaches. So thank you. So maybe Mike? Mike is there, yeah.
Audio problems we faced. Tere, this COVID situation has created a shock in our lives at multiple levels. I see, and especially also in the cultural sector, with the discussion, we have who are we? Why are we here? How do we work? And what do we do? And do you think this gives also a chance or an opportunity to create a systemic change in how we perceive culture or how culture is perceived?
Yeah, I think it's, of course, it's a chance, and I think we have to use it. So I was trying to explain this before, that, yes. But we have to not to only see how culture works, but in relation to the context, but how we are working it ourselves. So I think a debate around the cultural ecology must also consider the balance of an ecosystem and how this works. And I think a helpful methodology could be including this other indicator we were talking about, yes. Such, for example, an analysis of an equation that it goes in between abundance and scarcity, equality, hierarchy, damage, creation of value. So yes, I think definitely it is a chance, and it's not only a chance, I think it's a responsibility.
Yes, I would love with Transeurope Pulse to work on that together with you, the networks, to keep open the discussion and the advocacy for another way of perception of this whole ecosystem. I think we owe it to the cultural world and to the other care givers in the world.
Definitely.
Because I think also the cultural ecosystem is about caring. It's about caring for society, caring for freedom, caring for democracy and peace. And we can bring people home in offering beautiful cultural activities.
Yeah, definitely.
So I hope we can continue this webinar and go more in depth with all of you. There were a lot of very interesting questions, and I would like to thank everybody. So before we close the webinar platform, you will see now a brief question, how you liked the webinar. Please fill it in. It will only be there for 20 seconds. And then please bear with us for 2 more very brief questions in connections to how you understand value creation in creative economies. And what do you think are the priorities to be made for policy making? So please stay with us 1 more minute, because the question will appear after the seminar closes. And it is very important for the researchers what you think about this. We will share all the data collected via the DISCE website next week. You can find the website in the chat box. We will share it with you. So if you want to know more and keep posted, subscribe to the DISCE newsletter. And then furthermore, sorry, we couldn't answer everything right now, but the project will proceed and continue, and you will hear from us later this year. And maybe we will need a couple of more webinars to discuss more in depth these rich topics. We hope you liked it, and if you wish, hang out with us for a few more minutes, and I hope to see you soon again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.